Imagine waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Your house is completely dark. You know every door was locked before you went to bed. Then, you hear footsteps. Someone is inside your home. Before you can react, a flashlight shines directly into your face. A stranger is standing beside your bed. This wasn't a nightmare. It was the beginning of one of the longest manhunts in American history. Our story begins in June 1976 in Rancho Cordova, California. It was a quiet suburban community where families felt safe leaving their doors unlocked and children played outside until sunset. No one imagined a serial predator was already watching the neighborhood late one night. A young woman sleeping alone heard a strange noise. Before she could investigate, an intruder entered her bedroom. He had slipped into the house so quietly that no one nearby noticed. The attacker stayed calm and in complete control. Within minutes, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving almost no evidence behind. When police arrived, they searched the area for hours. There were a few footprints and scattered clues, but nothing that could identify the attacker. Detectives initially believed they were investigating a single violent crime. But only weeks later, another woman was attacked in a nearby neighborhood. The method was almost identical. The intruder entered at night. He carefully selected his victim, and once again, he escaped before police arrived. As more attacks occurred, detectives realized they weren't chasing an ordinary criminal. They were hunting someone who planned every move. Someone who watched his victims for days before striking. Someone who seemed to know exactly how to avoid capture. Fear spread across California. People installed stronger locks. Neighborhood watch groups began patrolling the streets. But no matter how careful residents became, the attacks continued. Police gave the unknown attacker a name that would soon make headlines across the country: the East Area Rapist. No one knew that this was only the beginning, because the crimes were about to become far more violent, and the killer's next move would shock the entire state. Each attack followed a chilling pattern. He didn't choose victims at random. Investigators discovered that he often visited neighborhoods days before an attack. Witnesses reported seeing a man riding a bicycle, walking through backyards, or standing quietly in parks, as if he was studying the area. Police now believe the attacker spent hours, sometimes days, watching his victims. He learned when they left for work, when they came home, when the lights went out. Only then would he make his move. He usually entered through an unlocked window or sliding glass door. Sometimes he even removed window screens in advance, returning days later when the opportunity was perfect. It was clear this wasn't impulsive. Everything was carefully planned. Detectives formed a special task force. Night patrols increased across Sacramento. Residents were warned to lock every door and window. Some families bought alarm systems. Others slept with baseball bats or firearms beside their beds. But none of it stopped him. Every time police thought they had predicted his next move, he attacked somewhere else. Then investigators noticed another disturbing detail. Several victims reported receiving strange phone calls before or after the attacks. Sometimes the caller said nothing. Sometimes there was only heavy breathing. In a few cases, the caller whispered threats before hanging up. Police believed these calls came from the attacker himself. He wasn't just committing crimes. He was enjoying the fear he created. Despite dozens of officers working around the clock, they still had no name. No clear suspect. Only a series of crimes connected by the same disturbing method. As months passed, the number of victims continued to rise. The media began covering the case almost every day. People across California started changing the way they lived. Parents checked every window before going to bed. Neighbors watched each other's homes. Entire communities lived in fear of a man no one had ever clearly identified. Then, during one attack, the killer made a small mistake. It seemed insignificant at the time, but years later, investigators would realize that this tiny clue would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. By 1978, investigators were exhausted. Hundreds of officers had worked the case. Thousands of tips had been received, but the attacker remained invisible. Then something unexpected happened. The attacks in Northern California suddenly stopped. For a brief moment, police believed their nightmare was finally over. Had the attacker moved away? Was he in prison for another crime? Or had he simply decided to stop? No one knew. Months passed without another attack. Then, hundreds of miles away in Southern California, a young couple was found murdered inside their home. At first, local detectives treated it as an isolated case. There was no obvious reason to connect it to the unsolved attacks near Sacramento. But another murder followed. Then another. Each crime shared disturbing similarities. The killer entered homes at night. He carefully selected his victims. He left very little evidence behind. Still, because the crimes happened in different counties, different police departments investigated them separately. Back then, sharing information between departments wasn't as fast or as organized as it is today. That mistake gave the killer a huge advantage. While one team searched for a rapist, another searched for a murderer, without realizing they were hunting the same man. Years later, investigators would finally connect the cases through forensic evidence. The man once known as the East Area Rapist was also responsible for the murders. A new name appeared in the media, the original Night Stalker. Then, just as suddenly as the attacks had begun, they stopped. After 1986, the killer vanished. No more attacks, no more murders, no letters, no phone calls, nothing. It was as if he had disappeared from the face of the earth. As the years passed, detectives retired. Evidence was packed into storage boxes. Victims tried to rebuild their lives. Many believed the case would never be solved. But hidden inside those old evidence boxes was something investigators couldn't fully use in the 1970s. A tiny biological sample. At the time, the technology to identify the killer didn't exist. Decades later, that single piece of evidence would become the key to exposing one of America's most notorious serial killers. More than 30 years had passed. The case had become one of California's most frustrating cold cases. Many of the detectives who had spent years chasing the killer had already retired. Some victims had lost hope that the man who changed their lives would ever be found. But one thing had changed: technology. The evidence collected during the attacks had been carefully preserved. In the 1970s, detectives couldn't do much with it. Now, modern DNA testing could reveal far more than anyone had imagined. Investigators confirmed that the same man was responsible for dozens of attacks and multiple murders across California. But there was one problem. When they compared the DNA with criminal databases, there was no match. It was as if the killer had never been arrested before. Most cold cases would have ended there. But investigators decided to try something completely different. Instead of searching for the killer's DNA, they searched for his relatives. Using a public genealogy database, experts looked for distant family members who shared small portions of the unknown suspect's DNA. It was like building an enormous family tree from a single branch. Thousands of names were examined. Families were traced back through old birth certificates, marriage records, and census documents. Slowly, the list became smaller, then smaller again. Eventually, investigators focused on one man. His name was Joseph James Durangelo. He was a former police officer. He had once served in law enforcement before leaving the profession years earlier. By 2018, he was living a quiet life in a Sacramento suburb. To his neighbors, he looked like an ordinary retired man. Nothing about him suggested he had been the target of one of the biggest investigations in American history. But detectives weren't ready to make an arrest. A family tree match wasn't enough. They needed proof, so they began watching him in secret. Every movement was carefully documented. They waited patiently for one opportunity, an opportunity that would either solve the case forever or send investigators back to the beginning. For several days, detectives quietly watched Joseph James Durangelo. They never approached him. They never questioned him. If he realized he was under surveillance, decades of work could be lost. Their goal was simple: obtain a DNA sample without alerting him. One day, investigators collected DNA from an item Durangelo had discarded in public. The sample was immediately sent to a forensic laboratory. Then came the waiting. Detectives knew this result could change everything. If the DNA didn't match, they would be back where they started. But if it did, one of America's greatest cold cases would finally be solved. Days later, the laboratory called. The DNA from the discarded item matched the DNA preserved from the crime scenes. It wasn't just a possible match. It was a conclusive forensic match. After more than 4 decades, investigators finally knew the identity of the man they had been hunting. On the morning of April 24, 2018, officers surrounded DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights, California. Neighbors watched in confusion as police vehicles quietly filled the street. No one expected what would happen next. Detectives moved in and arrested the 72-year-old without incident. The quiet retiree living on their street was accused of being the man who had terrorized California for years. News of the arrest spread around the world within hours. For many victims, it was the phone call they had waited a lifetime to receive. Some cried, some were speechless. Others said they had never believed this day would come. But the investigation wasn't over. Police still had to prove the case in court. With crimes dating back to the 1970s, prosecutors faced a huge challenge. Would decades-old evidence still be enough to convict him? Or would the man who escaped justice for 40 years find a way to escape once again? Joseph James DeAngelo's arrest was only the beginning. Investigators had identified their suspect through genetic genealogy, but now they had to prove it in court. Over the next several months, forensic experts compared DeAngelo's DNA with evidence collected from crime scenes dating back to the 1970s and 1980s. The results were overwhelming. The DNA matched case after case. The evidence connected him to a long series of rapes and murders that had remained unsolved for more than 4 decades. For the victims and their families, it was a moment they had waited a lifetime to see. Many had spent years wondering if the man who attacked them would ever face justice. Some detectives who had worked the original investigations had already retired. Others had passed away before seeing the case solved. In 2020, DeAngelo appeared in court and admitted responsibility for dozens of crimes. Victims were finally given the opportunity to speak directly to the man who had terrorized their lives. Some described the fear they had carried for decades. Others spoke about how one night had changed their lives forever. Many said they never believed they would live to see this day. After hearing the victims' statements, the judge sentenced Joseph James DeAngelo to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At the age of 74, the man who had spent years hiding in plain sight would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The case also changed criminal investigations forever. It became one of the first major cold cases solved through genetic genealogy, proving that old evidence could still reveal the truth decades later. Since then, investigators have used the same technique to solve many other cold cases that once seemed impossible. For more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer believed he had escaped justice. He stopped committing crimes. He lived an ordinary life. He blended into his neighborhood. But he underestimated one thing: time. As science advanced, the evidence he left behind decades earlier never disappeared. It waited, and eventually, it exposed him. The Golden State Killer remains one of the most significant cold cases ever solved. Not because of luck, but because investigators refused to give up, even after 40 years. Sometimes justice is delayed, but as this case proved, it isn't always denied. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more videos.